we're going to start. We're going to try to keep to the time, but I think it's really important. Can you hear me? Or does this thing work?
Yep.
Okay.
Hold a little closer.
I think it's really important that we have an opportunity to give some feedback from your groups and see what the kind of burning issues are, the burning questions. Because, as I said, this is a 4-part series, and we're going to start moving toward where do we go from here. So, solutions, think solutions. But we'll have more opportunity to do more of this as we go forward, and you're all going to find out about it. You're all going to be informed. So, do we have a sign-in sheet?
Problem. I will fix it.
Okay. Let's get a sign-in sheet. Then we can make sure that you know about all the events that are coming up. So while Heather is getting the sign-in sheet, let's just get started. So I asked each panelist to either keep notes or get somebody else in the group to keep notes. Now we're just going to do a kind of an overview of what were the important issues that came up. So either the panelists will do that or they'll call on whoever in the group decided to be that person. So let's start with Rochelle, and let's hear what happened, what's going on in her group.
Okay. So we talked about a bunch of issues, so I'll just try to get through a few of these. There are several issues, but one issue is this idea that white people and black people have to come together and fix the problem, of racism and this disconnection in the country. And what we talked about is no, we do not need to come together because black people did not start this problem. We were brought here through human trafficking. The problem lies with white people. Let's be real. This institutionalized racism, like the slavery, everything that has happened, it has been white people. Black people are completely innocent. And if a black person is a criminal or doing something, that a white person does not approve of, it is through circumstance, not because of their skin color. Their skin color has nothing to do with being a criminal. It's through circumstances. So we don't need to come together. What needs to happen is white people have to hold themselves accountable and fix what has been done. It needs to be reversed. And some of what we talked about is, for instance, reparations. One point that was brought up in the group was that the median wealth of white people in Boston is $247,000, and for black people, it's $8. The wealth is very unbalanced in not only Boston, but the entire country. We need to fix that because everything that white people have, and even the immigrants have, it's because of the free labor of black people. That's not fair, and a lot of black people are poor because of that. We need to correct that by giving us some wealth, reparations. And it could be in a number of ways. We talked about a number of ways that it could happen. It could be a package of shares in corporations. It could be real estate. It could be land. It could be programs to help the black youth build businesses. It could be a number of ways, but we need to talk about reparations because that is due to us. So we talked about that. And there was a comment in the group that money does not fix the issue. It's the mentality. It's the hatred and all of that. And yes, that's important. The mentality has to change, but money is also important because money matters because it affects our safety, it affects education, it affects health, and also, it just affects all of those things. So we do need money too. It's not just the mentality. Let me just see if there's anything I missed. Yep, so those are basically the things that we talked about in our group.
Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you. And so you see, we need to talk about race. And let's not shy away from reparations. Let's talk about reparations. Let's see how we fix the problem of white supremacy in this country and what do we do about reparations. So now Heather, in your group, you shared that with Farrell. So between the two of you, can you talk about what came up?
Yeah, so I prompted the group to think about what were the stories our families told us about race. How did we grow up with race or grow up talking or not talking about race? And so that was a really interesting conversation. We had a lot of people who grew up in Cambridge and Somerville expressing kind of their experiences. So, Black folks who were taught about which neighborhoods they couldn't go to and were like, nah, I'll figure it out myself, and then figured out, the hard way, having, physical confrontations and really negative experiences with white folks. And Cambridge Rindge and Latin, growing up there, going to school there, and how segregated it was, and coming in at a time where the two schools were merging and that there was a lot of conflict. There was also somebody who spoke to her experience growing up in Nairobi, Kenya, and, the experience of not talking about race because everybody looked, like her, and then coming to this country and being labeled as Black, and then, really trying to assert, I'm not Black, I'm Kenyan, and the complexity of growing up in that environment in the United States and in California, and hearing from white folks about their experiences and the ways that their family did or did not talk about race, and ways that they did or did not participate, in harming, people of color. And so I think there was a lot of emotional things that came up as a part of that. But yeah, Pharaoh, jump in.
Yeah, so specifically in terms of that last part about talking about the sorts of motivations that made people feel certain ways, I think is really important because, if you're raised by your parents, you'll likely just, when you're younger, believe anything they say. Like, you're a little child, you have no worldly knowledge to pull upon besides what you're given at a young age. So if you're given some sort of bigoted worldview, you'll maintain that until there is some external event that will make you think differently. So hearing those types of events that would motivate people to rely on, because you don't have worldly knowledge to pull upon before that, but you are born with empathy. So the sorts of things that might pull upon that, even if you're taught differently, and those sorts of events that bring people to that sort of conclusion, is really interesting to hear those sorts of things from people.
So we talked a lot about white privilege and kind of jumping off a lot of Heather, what you had mentioned earlier, is using white privilege being on the front lines and positive ways of using that to change the narrative. And one of the members posed the question about, well, if we change the paradigm or the structure, how would the question change? And that if white people had nothing to lose, we really wouldn't be having this conversation. So it's really about, everybody was very honest, and that was very much appreciated. And so we started to unpack a lot of those, breaking down those paradigms. So what would happen if you really had nothing to lose? And one example that was being used in the current situation was in terms of the government breakdown, or the shutdown that's currently existing. Wow. My Freudian slip there. So with the shutdown, what's happening right now is I read an article that the food stamps, for example, will, at some point, looks like sooner than later, will be dismantled. And so what happens? So we were talking about conditions in where a majority of the welfare program is offered to white Americans because they make up a predominant amount of the population, although a disproportionate amount is given, of the welfare system is given to people of minorities. And what's going to happen when food packets are going to be delivered to the homes, or you have to go and get your food packets? So that's going to bring everybody to a human level at this point here, when race and this issue of colorism and race and socioeconomic status pretty soon won't be a discussion anymore. It's going to be very much a basic human discussion. So it's good that we're starting to have these dialogues and breaking them down, because once we get to that level, it'll be a smoother transition for all of us. And they do want to keep us at the level, which is the few percentage that do still control the narrative, to keep us divided. And that when the breakdown really does happen, that it's going to be, they want it to be a disaster, and they want it to be more of a division for us, instead of finding solutions on how to survive at this point here.
Good.
So that's kind of one of the, and also we had another member of the group who was talking about conflicting demands between having the white privilege of moving to the suburbs, for example, and maybe with the possibility of moving to a better school system, a better neighborhood, safer, and that, you know, it might be experiencing having her child in the classroom with other children who might be having more social demands on them, and dealing with that. So it's a matter of the dilemma of personal or social agenda, and that being pulled oftentimes. So.
So in our group, we talked about a lot, and I want to just hopefully try and cover as much of it as possible. So we talked about, this is just going in order from top to bottom, because there's a lot of notes on here. You talked about reparations, similar to what you said, and one of the group members talked about how, you know, being black, we've already paid the tax just by being black, right? Like, our skin is a tax, and just walking around every day, we pay a tax. And so how do we kind of navigate reparations? We didn't get too deep in it, but how do you navigate reparations when, like, outside of, you know, what we know in terms of, like, slavery, we were paying, you know, every single day. We talked about a little bit about Afrofuturism, which I thought was a really awesome, it was a dope word that came up, because when I was on Diane's show, for example, you know, we talked about this idea of, and this is like totally like my utopian world, but like, what would life be like if colonialism never happened, right? If enslavement never happened, just kind of like, what would our narrative be, especially as people of color and black people? And that's something that, you know, kind of like sparked my interest. So you might be seeing a movie about it. Yeah, it definitely sparked my interest. We also did talk a lot about religion as well, and, you know, the whole notion that if your supreme being is a white god, right? He's a white man with blue eyes and blonde hair. What role does that play in white supremacy, right? Saying that the supreme being of your universe, right, is a white person, and a white man at that. Just things to think about. I'm not going to get into it, but just to think about. Yeah. We also talked about teachers as well, and the representation in schools, and how when we think about having black teachers and people of color teaching, we really think about it through the context of history, and that we also should be thinking about what does that mean to have, you know, black scientists and black math teachers and things like that. You know, it's more than just the historical context. We talked about the whole notion of kind of doing more than just talking the talk, but also walking the walk, right? It's cute to walk around with, you know, your fist up and you have Black Lives Matter on, or, you know, you go to a protest, but what do you do after that? What are you doing in your day-to-day life? Talked about that. I also, something that came up we didn't explicitly say, but I noticed, is that language is really important. It's very important. Using the word enslaved, right, versus slave, right, is that we were enslaved. This is something that happened, that it was done to us. We're not inherently slaves. Talking about that, we also talked about continental Africa as well, and how, you know, even till today, people separate, you know, like Northern Africa into, like, you know, Northern Africa is the Middle East, right, and then the rest is, like, you know, Black Africa. And just kind of how we talk about the continent of Africa as well. And, you know, I even shared my experience of going to Morocco and telling people, I was like, oh my God, I went to Africa. And they're like, yeah, but you went to Morocco. It's not like, you know, like Black Africa. So just having that as well. Again, things to think about. We talked about what role colonialism plays in the conversation. We also talked about, trying to see, we also named your quote there, Diane, about, like, you know, how capitalism, you know, capitalist society, you know, we're really overwhelmed by, like, white supremacy, and that's just kind of like what we're living in today. but how it also is really important to talk about the many complexities of the African diaspora. A couple of the people in our group were educators or deal with, like young people and the youth, and also how do you navigate young people who have ties to their specific stop, wherever the boat dropped their people off, right? So my boat dropped my people off in Barbados, right? And growing up, I was like, I'm from Barbados, we're not like the Haitians, we're not like the Dominicans, kids having these feelings and these sentiments, and how do you kind of show them that our similarities are so much more than our differences. And our boat may have came from the same origin, right? It's just that your stop was here and my stop was there, and just talking about that. I was trying to like cover all of it, but yeah, I think that kind of like sums up a lot of what we talked about. But just I think long story short, that this is a really complex issue, and it's in every single crevice of our beings, like black, white, whatever it may be. It's in every single crevice of our beings, and whatever your calling is. Maybe your calling is to tackle the education system. Maybe your calling is to tackle socioeconomic issues. But whatever it is, it's all needed and it's all important.
So thank you. This is an incredible panel, and all of you could be on this panel as well, and I hope you will be. You all have important contribution to make. We all must contribute to this discussion of race. Let me leave you with one more thought. This is one that I like a lot. Farrell doesn't like this, but I'm going to. He doesn't like this comparison, but let's see what you think. Okay, symbolism. The important. We're talking about white supremacy and living in a white supremacist society. So let's look at the symbolism that we have. Here in the United States, somebody fought a civil war, and the South was defeated in that war. But people want to call on a heritage and want to fly the flag of the defeated slavers, and they say, that's our heritage. They want to continue to put up flowers at these monuments and at these graves for the Southern traitors. Let's look now at Germany. Germany had Nazis. After World War II, they routed out those Nazis. You cannot fly a swastika in Germany. You will go to prison. You might be beaten on the street if you even indicate some kind of a swastika, some kind of a Nazi salute. The symbols were removed, and they weren't put in history museums. They were removed and discarded and in disgrace. Now, why do we still have a white supremacist society? Because we haven't removed even the basic symbolism of white supremacy. We haven't done it, and we don't want to do it. So let's look at that. Let's talk about race. So thank you very much for coming. We're going to continue this discussion. We're coming back here to the same place on Juneteenth. This is in celebration of Martin Luther King Day. And we all know that Martin Luther King was killed because he talked and he spoke out. So here we are, we're speaking out. We're following in the footsteps of Martin Luther King. You cannot kill an idea. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Make sure that you sign your name so we have your contact info. We can be in touch with you for the next step.